Imagine something external, taking control of your mind, your body, forcing you to act in ways that, well, serve its survival, even at your own expense.
Yeah, it sounds like pure science fiction, doesn't it? That classic horror idea of the zombie.
Exactly. That loss of control, being, I don't know, a passenger in your own body while something else is behind the wheel.
Really chilling idea.
But what if elements of this terrifying concept actually have roots in real biology?
And maybe not just as some rare fluke, but as a sophisticated evolutionary strategy used by tiny organisms all around us.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into the fascinating, sometimes pretty unsettling world of how pathogens,
So viruses, parasites, even misfolded proteins.
right, how they can subtly or sometimes not so subtly manipulate the behavior of their hosts.
Yeah, we've been digging into this deep research report that pulls together the current science on this. It looks at, the neurobiology, the evolutionary drivers, the ecological side of things.
And our goal today is to pull out the most important, maybe the most mind-bending insights from all that material for you, to understand the sheer sophistication of these biological puppeteers.
And what it all means for the host, whether that host is, say, an ant on the grounds or a rodent or, well, potentially even us.
It really challenges how we usually think about disease, doesn't it?
Totally. It's not just infection making you feel sick. It's about infection actively changing who you are or what you do for its own benefit.
So let's start right there. What exactly is pathogen-induced behavioral alteration? The research is clear. This isn't just, feeling run down because you're ill.
That's the key difference. It's an active strategy by the pathogen. It's changing the host's actions, often in very specific, sometimes really dramatic ways,
And the goal is always,
to boost its own chances.
yeah.
Survival, replication, getting into the next host. It's basically manipulation for biological gain.
And the range of this manipulation is just wild, from things you might barely notice to these incredibly specific actions.
Absolutely. On one end, you have these subtle correlations, like increased irritability or personality shifts, sometimes reported in people with Lyme disease,
Okay.
or some subtle personality traits associated with latent toxoplasma infection in humans. But then you get the really dramatic stuff.
Like the rodent losing its fear of cats.
Exactly. Losing its fear of its main predator. Or that ant compelled to climb up a plant stem to a specific spot and bite down right before it dies. Just incredible.
So why is studying this so important? I mean, beyond the obvious wow factor, which is definitely there.
Well, it's fundamental for understanding infectious disease, obviously. But it also gives us these amazing insights into coevolution.
That biological arms race.
Right, that constant battle between species. And it teaches us a lot about how the brain works and, frankly, how it can be hijacked.
Uh-huh.
It affects our view of ecology, how ecosystems function. And there's this growing body of research looking into potential links with human behavioral disorders too, things like aggression, maybe even some psychiatric conditions.
So it really sounds like this ongoing evolutionary dance, this back and forth.
That's exactly what the diversity suggests, a dynamic evolutionary battle. Pathogens that get better at controlling hosts, they get a huge advantage.
And hosts that evolve resistance.
They survive better, so there's pressure on both sides.
And it seems like the level of control, how sophisticated it is, often matches how critical that behavior is for the pathogen's life cycle.
That's a really key insight from the research, yeah. Think about it. Lyme bacteria might cause irritability, right? But that irritability isn't strictly needed for a tick to pass it on.
Okay, compared to something like rabies.
Exactly. Rabies needs the host to bite. Its whole transmission cycle depends on it. So the virus has evolved these incredibly potent ways to induce aggression and that biting compulsion.
Or toxoplasma needing to get from a rodent into a cat.
Right. Manipulating the rodent's fear of cats isn't just helpful. It's essential for the parasite strategy. It has to happen.
Which brings us back to that Ophiocordyceps fungus, the zombie ant fungus. That level of precision, forcing the ant to a very specific spot to die. That feels like the absolute peak of this evolutionary pressure.
It really does. I mean, the ant isn't just wandering off to die. It's compelled to perform this complex sequence. Climb, get to the right height, orient itself, bite down hard on a leaf vein, maybe even time for optimal humidity.
Wow.
That level of specific, intricate control points to a really long, intense coevolutionary history, where even tiny improvements in the fungus's manipulative ability gave it a significant edge in spreading its spores.
So understanding these evolutionary drivers, could that actually help us anticipate how new diseases might evolve? Could we predict if they might develop behavioral manipulation?
Potentially, yes. If a new pathogen spread could be boosted by, say, making hosts more social or driving them to migrate, studying how other pathogens evolve, these tricks might give us clues about the likelihood of that new one developing similar strategies under certain pressures.
Okay, let's dive into some specific examples then, starting with maybe the most famous or infamous viral puppeteers, the ones that go straight for the brain. Neurotropic viruses.
And rabies lysovirus is the absolute classic, terrifying example of viral-induced aggression.
Mm.
It's so notorious because, well, once symptoms show up, it's almost always fatal.
How does it actually get in and take over?
Typically through a bite from an infected animal, the virus gets into the saliva, then into the tissue, and then it does something pretty incredible. It travels along the peripheral nerves, heading straight for the central nervous system.
Like using the nerves as a highway?
Exactly. It essentially hijacks the neuron's own transport system. It binds to this receptor, P75NTR, which normally helps nerve cells grow and survive. Binding there actually speeds up the virus's journey up the nerve fiber to the brain. It gets there disturbingly fast.
And once it's in the brain?
It causes severe inflammation, encephalitis. But interestingly, the actual physical damage to the brain tissue, at least early on, isn't always massive or obvious.
Suggesting it's not just about destruction.
Right. It suggests it's more about subtly hijacking the existing neural circuits rather than just blowing things up. It's also really good at hiding from the immune system initially, and it can even tighten the blood-brain barrier.
Making it harder to treat.
Unfortunately, yes. Makes it much harder for potential treatments to get where they need to go.
So how does it achieve this manipulation? What's it doing in the brain?
The research points to very targeted interference. A lot of the action seems to happen in the limbic system areas like the amygdala, the hippocampus, which are crucial for emotions, drives like aggression, memory.
The core emotional parts of the brain.
Exactly. And higher-level thinking centers often seem less affected, at least initially, which kind of fits that picture of an animal driven by raw instinct or compulsion, not reason.
And specific brain chemicals must be involved, right? Neurotransmitters.
Definitely.
Yeah.
A really key mechanism seems to be disrupting serotonin signaling. Serotonin helps regulate mood, impulse control. It puts the brakes on aggression. The virus actually accumulates in these specific brainstem areas, the raphe, which are the main source of serotonin for the rest of the brain. So by messing with those cells, the virus essentially cuts the brake lines on aggression.
And I read something kind of strange about it mimicking snake venom.
It's pretty wild, yeah. A piece of the rabies virus protein, it's called RVG, its structure looks remarkably similar to certain snake neurotoxins.
Seriously?
Yeah. And this lets the virus interact with specific nicotine receptors in the brain, ACHRs. These receptors are involved in arousal, attention, anxiety, all states relevant to rabies behavior. The virus uses these receptors to get into muscle cells at the bite site, but this interaction in the brain seems to directly influence the host's mental state.
And the physical symptoms, like the foaming at the mouth, that helps spread it too?
Precisely. The virus causes paralysis in the throat muscles, the pharyngeal muscles you use to swallow. Swallowing becomes incredibly painful or impossible.
Yeah.
So saliva builds up in the mouth and throat. That's the foaming. And that saliva is just packed with virus particles. So you combine an animal that's compelled to bite with saliva that's highly infectious.
You've got a perfect transmission machine.
An incredibly effective one, yeah.
And there are different ways rabies can look, right? Different forms?
Yes. The research talks about two main clinical forms. There's the furious form, that's the more common one, maybe 70–80% of cases. That's what most people picture. Hyperactivity, agitation, aggression, hallucinations.
And the biting.
And the biting compulsion, definitely. Plus, the famous hydrophobia or aerophobia, fear of water, or even drafts, which triggers these painful spasms and the gagging and foaming.
And the other form?
That's the paralytic form, sometimes called dumb rabies. It's about 20–30% of cases. It's less traumatic, progressive muscle weakness, paralysis, eventually leading to coma and death. Often harder to diagnose because that obvious aggression isn't there.
So when you look at furious rabies, that unprovoked aggression, the drive to bite, the altered mental state, the loss of control, I mean, the zombie parallels are kind of hard to ignore.
Oh, absolutely. It resonates strongly. While no real pathogen brings back the dead, that transformation into this aggressive being, seemingly focused only on transmitting its disease, it's probably the closest biological parallel we have to that core zombie idea.
The idea of the host's actions being completely dictated by the infection.
Exactly. For the infection's own propagation. It's easy to imagine how horrifying encounters with rabid animals could have fueled ancient fears and folklore that eventually, contributed to the zombie archetype we see today.
But rabies isn't the only infection that can mess with behavior like this.
Oh, not at all. Lots of viruses, bacteria too, can invade the nervous system and cause encephalitis brain inflammation. And that can lead to a whole range of neurological and behavioral problems.
Including aggression or personality changes.
Yes. The research suggests a significant number of acute encephalitis cases involve things like aggression or violence. It's been seen in outbreaks like the Spanish flu, encephalitis lethargica, herpes simplex, encephalitis.
Okay.
And it's seen with neurological complications from diseases like neurosyphilis or cerebral malaria, too. There's even research linking chronic brain damage from infections like AIDS dementia complex or other viral encephalitides to an increased risk of criminal behavior later on.
So basically, inflammation or damage in the brain from various pathogens can fundamentally change how it works.
Exactly. And it's not just viruses. Lyme neuroborreliosis, that's the later stage neurological form of Lyme disease from the Borrelia bacteria spread by ticks, that's also been linked to behavioral changes.
What kind of changes are seen with Lyme?
Well, the research mentions things like irritability, depression, anxiety, cognitive problems, brain fog. But crucially, it also documents an association with aggression.
Agree.
Yeah, one study that the material discussed found that a pretty high percentage of late-stage patients developed some form of aggression.
Right.
And, really concerningly, a small but significant number were involved in homicidal acts.
Wow, that's startling. And the research highlighted something critical about those very severe cases, didn't it? A common factor.
It did. A major issue was the long delay in diagnosis and treatment. In that specific study looking at homicidal cases, the average delay was something like 9 years.
9 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which strongly suggests that prolonged untreated infection and the resulting chronic neuroinflammation or immune system chaos likely causes cumulative, maybe irreversible damage or disruption to the brain pathways that regulate personality and behavior.
Which really underlines the importance of catching these things early.
Absolutely. It's a vital takeaway. For infections that can get into the brain, especially bacterial ones like Lyme, where we have treatments, timely diagnosis and treatment, can be absolutely crucial to prevent these severe, lasting behavioral consequences.
Okay, let's shift gears a little. Viruses have another trick, right? Going dormant, hiding out in our cells for years, sometimes life. Viral latency.
It's a really clever survival strategy for the virus. They basically insert their genetic material into the host cell, often just sit there quietly in the nucleus, shutting down most activity so the immune system doesn't notice them.
Like herpes viruses.
Herpes viruses are the classic examples. Cold sores, chickenpox, which then hides and can come back as shingles, monovirus, EBV, CMV. HIV is another key example. It integrates its genome right into our DNA, creating this latent reservoir that's incredibly difficult to clear out completely.
So they're just waiting. What wakes them up? What triggers reactivation?
The research points to several triggers. Stress is a big one. Physical stress like fever, surgery, even just sunlight exposure for cold sores.
Yeah.
Psychological stress too.
Makes sense.
Immunosuppression is huge, whether that's from diseases like HIV/AIDS or medical treatments like chemotherapy or long-term steroids, anything that weakens the immune system's surveillance. Co-infection with other bugs can do it too. Some bacteria, for example, can apparently reactivate EBV by causing DNA damage in the cells where EBV is hiding. Even some drugs can accidentally activate viral genes.
The report brings up this really thought-provoking, maybe slightly unsettling idea, the potential for global-scale viral reactivation.
Yeah, this is more speculative, definitely. But given the rapid global changes happening, it's a scenario scientists are starting to consider. It asks a question. Could widespread environmental stressors act as catalysts for reactivation across entire populations?
What kind of environmental stressors are we talking about?
Things like cumulative exposure to certain chemical pollutants, maybe major global health crises like a novel pandemic adding stress to immune systems, or the broad impacts of climate change.
Such as?
Chronic heat stress, nutritional stress if food security is affected, or even just the massive physical and psychological stress of displacement due to climate events.
So the idea is, if these kinds of large-scale stressors are broadly weakening immunity or causing chronic stress in lots of people,
then theoretically, they could lower the threshold for these common latent viruses, the ones many of us carry, to reactivate more frequently across the population. Maybe not one big event, but a rising tide.
leading to potentially more cases of things like shingles or health issues linked to reactivated CMV or EBV spread across communities.
Exactly. And something like the COVID-19 pandemic adds another layer of immune challenge that could potentially contribute to this dynamic. The research frames it as a potential area needing more investigation, especially given the scale of environmental change we're facing. It's a reminder of how interconnected environmental health, individual health, and population immunity really are.
Okay, let's move from the microscopic viruses and bacteria to maybe the most famous masters of manipulation, parasites and fungi.
Ah, yes. They often employ these incredibly complex, multi-stage strategies that seem almost perfectly designed for their life cycles. And Toxoplasma gondii is probably the most widely known example affecting mammals, including us. It affects maybe a third of all humans globally.
A third? That's huge. Remind us of its life cycle.
It primarily revolves around cats. Cats are the definitive host. That's where the parasite reproduces sexually, and they shed the infectious stage, called oocysts, in their feces.
Okay.
Other warm-blooded animals, including us humans, are intermediate hosts. We get infected usually by accidentally swallowing those oocysts, maybe from contaminated soil, water, unwashed veggies, or by eating undercooked meat containing tissue cysts from another infected animal.
And in us, it just stays there.
In us and other intermediate hosts, it forms these dormant cysts, often in muscle and brain tissue, and it can stay latent there for years, potentially for life.
And its most famous manipulation is in rodents, right? The fatal attraction.
Yes, that's the textbook case. Infected rodents lose their innate, absolutely critical fear of cat odors, specifically cat odors.
Not other predators.
Primarily cat odors. Some studies suggest they might even become attracted to the smell, which you can see is hugely beneficial for the parasite.
Because it makes the rodent much more likely to get eaten by a cat.
Exactly, which is precisely what Toxo needs to get back into its definitive host, the cat, to complete its sexual life cycle. Infected rodents also tend to be more active, more exploratory, less afraid of new things generally.
What about in humans? You mentioned possible links to behavior earlier.
Right. The research discusses correlations between having this latent T. gondii infection and certain behavioral changes. This includes links to increased impulsivity and aggression. Some studies connect it to things like intermittent explosive disorder.
Okay.
There are also reports of more subtle personality shifts, like changes in novelty-seeking, conscientiousness, sometimes in gender-specific ways. And yeah, research is ongoing into potential associations with more serious conditions like schizophrenia and suicidal behavior, although the links to broader psychiatric conditions are complex and not always consistent across studies. It's an active area.
How on earth does this tiny single-celled parasite actually manage to influence something as complex as brain function and behavior?
It's remarkably clever. The parasite itself actually has genes to synthesize LDOP.
The precursor to dopamine.
Exactly. So cysts forming in specific brain areas might locally increase dopamine levels. And dopamine is key for reward, motivation, novelty seeking. That could explain some personality changes and maybe ties into dopamine-related disorders like schizophrenia.
So it's directly messing with brain chemistry.
It seems like it. It also appears to affect hormone levels. Especially testosterone studies show increases in infected male rodents, decreases in females, which could influence aggression, dominance, things like that.
Interesting.
And the parasite seems to have a preference for forming cysts in certain brain regions, like the amygdala.
Which is central for fear and emotion.
Right. So cysts physically being there could directly interfere with normal fear processing. And beyond just location and chemicals, the research even mentions epigenetic changes.
Changing how genes are read?
Yeah. The parasite seems to cause changes in DNA methylation, basically, how genes are switched on or off in the amygdala of infected rodents, specifically affecting genes related to vasopressin, which is involved in social behavior, and importantly, fear responses related to predators.
So it's attacking on multiple fronts. Neurotransmitters, hormones, gene expression.
Exactly. It's subtly but effectively tweaking these fundamental circuits for fear, reward, social interaction, all in ways that boost his chances of getting back into a cat, often without causing such severe damage that it kills the intermediate host too quickly.
Okay, brace yourself. Let's talk about the most visually striking example, the one that always comes up. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, the zombie ant fungus.
Ah, yes. Nightmare fuel for ants, definitely. It infects certain ant species and takes behavioral control to this extreme, almost cinematic level.
Walk us through the ant's final journey. What happens?
It starts when an ant encounters a fungal spore. The fungus grows inside the ant's body, likely secreting various chemical compounds, maybe neurotoxins. The ant's behavior starts getting weird. It leaves the nest, wanders erratically.
Okay.
Then comes the really chilling orchestrated part. The fungus compels the ant to climb up vegetation. This is called summiting behavior.
It forces it to climb.
It seems to drive it upwards. It maneuvers the ant, often to a specific height, frequently onto the underside of a leaf, oriented just so. And there, the fungus induces the death grip.
The death grip.
The ant bites down hard onto a leaf vein or the edge of the leaf with its mandibles and just locks there. It can't let go. And then it dies in that position.
And then the fungus.
Then, usually sprouting from the back of the ant's head, this fungal fruiting body, the stalk, erupts. It grows out and eventually releases its spores.
Which rain down on the ants below.
Precisely. The elevated position, the death grip holding it there, it's all perfectly positioned for maximum spore dispersal onto the foraging trails below.
How does the fungus possibly achieve that level of precise control? It sounds like something out of science fiction.
Scientists are still working out the exact chemical cocktail, but it's thought the fungus secretes a complex mix of neurotoxins and other bioactive compounds. These likely interfere with the ant's nervous system, its chemosensory perception, maybe even its internal clock, to control the timing of the climb and bite.
Does it control the brain directly?
Interestingly, some research suggests the fungus might extensively infiltrate the ant's muscles, especially the mandibular muscles for the death grip, forming a network within the muscles themselves. So it might be controlling the body more directly, bypassing the brain for some actions until after the ant is dead. RNA silencing mechanisms have also been speculated about. It's complex.
And the research points out something really remarkable about this summiting behavior, doesn't it? It's not unique to this one fungus.
That's right. This specific strategy, making an infected insect host climb high before it dies to help spread spores or viral particles, it seems to have evolved independently multiple times in completely different unrelated pathogens.
In different kinds of organisms.
Totally different. You see similar summiting behavior in flies infected by Entomocera fungi. That's a completely different fungal group, not closely related to Cordyceps at all.
Wow.
And you also see it in certain caterpillars infected by baculoviruses, which are DNA viruses.
So a fungus, another unrelated fungus, and a virus all evolved the same trick, making their hosts climb.
It's a stunning example of convergent evolution. You have these very different pathogens infecting relatively small hosts. They all face the same challenge.
Yeah.
How do you get your infectious particles dispersed effectively from way down low? Forcing the host to climb high before dying offers a massive fitness advantage for dispersal by wind or gravity. So evolution seems to have arrived at the same solution multiple times using entirely different biological toolkits.
Okay, let's move to the final category of manipulators discussed in the material, the really unusual ones, prions.
Right, prions are fundamentally different beasts altogether. They're not viruses, not bacteria, not fungi or parasites. They are misfolded proteins.
Just protein.
Just protein. Specifically, a misfolded version called PRPSC of a normal protein, PRPC, that's found in our brains, particularly on neurons. They cause this group of fatal neurodegenerative diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or TSEs.
And they have no DNA or RNA, no genetic material at all.
None. They're purely protein-based infectious agents.
How can just a protein be infectious and cause disease?
It's a kind of terrifying chain reaction. The abnormal misfolded PRPSC protein acts like a template. When it bumps into a normal PRPC protein, it somehow induces the normal one to misfold into the abnormal shape too.
So it converts the good protein into bad protein.
Exactly. And these misfolded proteins then stick together, they aggregate, forming clumps in the brain. This aggregation process is toxic to neurons, kills them off, and leads to the characteristic spongy appearance of the brain tissue under a microscope. Hence the name spongiform.
What are the symptoms like? What happens to someone with a prion disease?
It's progressive, relentless brain damage. The classic symptoms include rapidly progressing dementia, severe problems with movement and coordination, ataxia, muscle jerks, and significantly for our discussion today, major psychiatric and behavioral problems often occur.
Psychiatric issues from prions.
Absolutely. Things like depression, anxiety, irritability,
Right.
really dramatic personality changes, psychosis, agitation, these are common features. And in some forms, like variant CJD, these psychiatric symptoms can actually be the first things that appear even before the more obvious dementia or motor problems kick in. And sadly, these diseases are invariably fatal. There's no cure.
The material mentioned different types in humans and animals.
Correct. In humans, the most common is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. Most cases are sporadic, meaning they seem to arise randomly with no known cause. Some are familial, linked to inherited genetic mutations, and some are iatrogenic, meaning they were accidentally transmitted through medical procedures in the past, like contaminated instruments or growth hormone treatments.
And variant CJD.
Variant CJD, or VCJD, is the form linked to eating meat from cattle infected with bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, mad cow disease. Kuru was another human form found in a specific tribe in New Guinea, linked to ritualistic cannibalism involving brain tissue.
And in animals.
Besides BSE in cattle, there's scrapie, which has affected sheep and goats for centuries. And the one causing a lot of concern now, chronic wasting disease, or CWD, which affects deer, elk, moose, and reindeer.
How do these things actually spread?
It really varies.
Yeah.
Sporadic CJD, we don't know the trigger. Iatrogenic was medical accidents. VCJD, primarily through eating contaminated beef, rarely through blood transfusion. Kuru, through consuming infected tissue. CWD is concerning because it spreads between animals through direct contact saliva, urine, feces, and also indirectly through environmental contamination.
Can humans get CJD from casual contact?
No, there's no evidence that standard CJD or VCJD can be spread through normal day-to-day contact or through the air.
One of the scariest things about prion diseases, according to the research, is the time frame involved.
Absolutely. The incubation periods are exceptionally disturbingly long. We're talking years, often decades, between exposure to the prion and the first signs of illness. Yeah. Iatrogenic CJD cases have shown up anywhere from 15 months to over 30 years after the exposure. VCJD incubation is estimated at maybe 10-20 years, maybe longer. Kuru could take decades to appear. CWD in deer is usually shorter, maybe 16 months to 4 years or more, but still a significant silent period.
So an infected person or animal could be carrying this, potentially shedding infectious prions in some cases like CWD, for years and years before anyone knows they're sick.
Exactly. It makes tracking outbreaks, understanding transmission routes, and preventing spread incredibly difficult. And adding to that challenge is the sheer toughness of prions themselves.
They're hard to destroy.
Astonishingly resistant. Standard sterilization methods that kill bacteria and viruses easily heat, chemicals, radiation often don't fully inactivate prions. They're extraordinarily stable molecules.
Which is a massive problem for something like CWD spreading in the wild.
It's a huge issue. Infected deer shed CWD prions in their saliva, urine, feces. These prions get into the soil, they can be taken up by plants, they contaminate water sources.
Yeah.
And because they're so stable, they can persist in that environment, remaining infectious for years. The research mentions at least 2 years, but likely much longer. They create these persistent environmental reservoirs.
Making it almost impossible to eradicate from an area once it's established.
Extremely difficult, yes.
Right.
So you have this combination, extremely long, silent incubation periods where hosts can be infectious, and an infectious agent that's incredibly tough and persists in the environment for years. It's a unique and formidable public health and ecological challenge.
Okay, so looking across all these different manipulators, viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites, even these weird prions, they're biologically worlds apart, yet they all manage to hijack host behavior. Are there common strategies, common targets in the brain they seem to zero in on?
That's one of the most fascinating threads running through the research, yeah. Despite all their diversity, many of these pathogens seem to converge on similar fundamental neural pathways and brain regions.
Which areas keep popping up?
The limbic system is a recurring theme. Areas like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, these deep brain structures that govern emotion, motivation, fear, memory, instinctual drives.
The core behavioral circuits.
Exactly. The report specifically mentions how certain neurons in the hypothalamus, called AGRP neurons, which are involved in regulating things like feeding, but also aggression and fear, could be particularly vulnerable targets. It suggests this interesting link between manipulating metabolic state and manipulating behavior. The brainstem also comes up frequently, controlling basic functions and being the source for major neurotransmitters, like we saw with rabies hitting the serotonin system there.
And messing with neurotransmitters, those brain chemicals, seems like a really common tactic.
Absolutely. T. gondii, potentially tweaking dopamine, rabies disrupting serotonin and interacting with acetylcholine receptors, and beyond specific chemicals, just generalized neuroinflammation. The brain's immune response to infection that itself can cause widespread behavioral and cognitive symptoms. Immune molecules like cytokines and brain immune cells like microglia play a big role there.
Some pathogens also seem to act like little chemical weapons factories, right? producing their own toxins.
Yes, like the Ophiocordyceps fungus, almost certainly producing neurotoxins or other bioactive molecules to directly control the ant's muscles and nervous system. It's actually helpful to compare this to how certain environmental neurotoxins work.
Like lead or meth.
Yeah. Lead exposure can cause cognitive problems and aggression. Methamphetamine abuse leads to severe behavioral changes, psychosis, aggression. These chemicals disrupt brain function. Pathogens that evolve to produce their own specific molecules targeting neural pathways. They're essentially acting as biological chemists, developing highly targeted biochemical tools, maybe analogous to how some animals evolve venom.
Thinking about how these things spread, the environment clearly plays a massive role, too.
Oh, absolutely crucial. The research reminds us how much transmission dynamics depend on environmental factors. For airborne spread, things like humidity, temperature, ventilation matter hugely, something we all became very aware of during the pandemic.
And those long incubation or latency periods we talked about, that's a huge challenge for tracking diseases.
A massive epidemiological challenge, yes. They create these large populations of silent carriers who can transmit before showing symptoms. Makes tracking and control incredibly difficult, whether you're talking about latent HIV, latent TB, or people incubating prion diseases for decades.
And the persistence of things like CWD prions in soil or Toxoplasma oocysts, they create these long-term environmental threats.
Right, which ties right back into the potential impacts of global change we discussed earlier. Climate change shifting, where pathogens and their vectors, like ticks or mosquitoes, can survive, altering rainfall, affecting fungal spore survival, changing animal migration patterns, potentially spreading things like CWD.
It increases the chances for contact.
It increases the points of contact and interaction between humans, animals, and these pathogens, potentially raising the risk of spillover events, including with behavior-altering diseases.
So this whole evolutionary arms race is playing out on a rapidly changing environmental stage.
Precisely. The manipulations are adaptive for the pathogen, they increase its fitness. Their specificity often tells us about long coevolutionary histories. And pathogens have even evolved ways to manage the host's immune response, often suppressing it just enough to let the pathogen establish itself and manipulate, but not so much that the host dies before the manipulation achieves its goal, like transmission.
The research also mentioned pathogens interfering with chemical communication, like pheromones.
Yeah, chemosignaling is fundamental for behavior in so many species. Pheromones for communication within a species, interomones between species. T. gondii, eye-messing with the rodent's response to cat odor, is a prime example of hijacking these pathways.
Could pathogens potentially mess with our chemical signals? Like how we smell or perceive other scents?
It's an interesting thought. An infection causing inflammation could certainly alter an individual's body odor profile, or perhaps alter how another individual perceives those scent cues. Could that subtly influence social interactions in ways that affect transmission? It's speculative but plausible. Pathogens are known to interact with chemokine systems in our bodies, which are all about chemical signals guiding cell movement, especially immune cells. Sometimes they seem to hijack these systems too. It's another potential layer of manipulation using the host's own complex communication networks.
Okay, let's bring it back to where we started, that zombie idea. The material traces the zombie lore a bit.
Right. From Haitian Vodou origins, the idea of a reanimated body, controlled by a sorcerer, lacking free will, often used for labor, then shifting dramatically in Western pop culture, mainly thanks to George Romero's films, into these flesh-eating, infectious ghouls spread by bites.
And in fiction, zombies often stand in for other things, right? They're metaphors.
Definitely. They tap into deep societal fears, anxieties about nuclear war, critiques of mindless consumerism, and maybe most relevant today, fears about pandemics, loss of individuality, contagion, and societal breakdown. They're a really flexible metaphor for whatever scares us collectively.
So if we compare those fictional zombie tropes to the real-world pathogens we've been discussing, where do we see actual overlaps, and where does biology diverge from fiction?
Well, there are some definite, sometimes chilling parallels. Unprovoked aggression and a compulsion to bite.
Strong parallel with furious rabies, maybe echoes in some late-stage Lyme cases too.
Exactly. Mental degradation, loss of higher cognitive function, loss of rational control.
Clear parallels with prion diseases causing dementia and psychosis. Rabies delirium fits too. Maybe the subtle influences of T. gondii or even severe drug toxicity like meth, showing how chemicals can induce similar states.
Right. A compulsion to infect others.
The rabid animal biting is the clearest example. You could argue the zombie ant positioning itself for spore dispersal is a form of compulsion to infect the area below.
A profound loss of free will, being controlled by something else.
The Ophiocordyceps fungus driving the ant's specific actions feels like the strongest real-world example of an external agent completely overriding host autonomy. Tigandi has more subtle influence, but certainly compromises the host's normal drives.
Physical degradation.
Some parallels there, too. Not reanimation, but certainly diseases like Ebola cause horrific bodily damage. Long-term meth use has visible physical effects, and prion diseases cause literal holes in the brain. But the absolute key difference.
Undeath. Persistence after death. No known pathogen reanimates dead tissue. The infected hosts we're talking about are living organisms, however dramatically their behavior is altered. Eventually they succumb to the disease or predation.
So no literal zombie apocalypse with shuffling corpses rising from the grave. But the research talks about this concept of a functional zombie. What does that mean?
Right. It's a useful way to think about it biologically. A living host whose behavior has been fundamentally hijacked by a pathogen purely to serve that pathogen's reproductive or transmission agenda.
Like the rabid dog or the zombie ant locked on the leaf.
Exactly. There's this profound loss of the organism's own autonomy. Its own drives seem overridden. This biological reality, the potential for an external agent, an infection, to compromise our most fundamental sense of self, our control over our own mind and body, that resonates deeply with the primal fear that the fictional zombie taps into. It's the chilling biological principle that makes the trope so powerful.
This is clearly such a dynamic and important area of science. Where is the research heading? What are the frontiers?
It's evolving incredibly fast. It's inherently interdisciplinary. You need microbiologists, neuroscientists, ecologists, immunologists, geneticists all working together. A big focus now is really nailing down the precise molecular mechanism.
Well, exactly which molecules the pathogens use.
Exactly. Identifying the specific toxins, the proteins, how they interact with host receptors, which neural circuits they target, using all the modern tools, omics technologies, advanced brain imaging, genetic manipulation techniques to dissect these interactions at a really fine-grained level.
And understanding the impact of global change, that seems critical too.
Absolutely essential. How will climate change, pollution, habitat loss affect the spread, prevalence, and evolution of these manipulating pathogens and our interactions with them? That's a major urgent question.
Are there potential threats we should be thinking about emerging from this research field itself?
Well, the risk of zoonotic spillover pathogens jumping from animals to humans is always there, and potentially increasing as human and animal habitats overlap more. Rabies is zoonotic, Tigandi is, and there's ongoing concern, though the risk is currently thought low, about CWD potentially crossing the species barrier to humans.
And viruses evolve.
Right. Viral evolution is constant. Pathogens like rabies or influenza could potentially change in ways that alter their transmission, severity, or maybe even their behavioral effects, though that's more speculative.
And the research report touches on a darker, though maybe still hypothetical, concern: engineered threats.
Yes. This is the dual-use dilemma. As we get better and better at understanding how, exactly, pathogens manipulate behavior at the molecular level, it raises the theoretical possibility that someone could try to use that knowledge maliciously.
To engineer a pathogen with specific behavioral effects.
The material gives the hypothetical example of, say, trying to modify rabies to make it transmit more easily between humans, or change its incubation time, or specifically enhance aggression. It sounds like science fiction, but the fundamental knowledge being gained could potentially be misused.
Which highlights the need for oversight.
Absolutely. The very knowledge we need to develop defenses, vaccines, therapies against these natural manipulations could in theory be weaponized. It underscores the critical need for strong biosecurity protocols, ethical guidelines, and open international discussions about the implications of this kind of research.
So what about public health preparedness? What do we need to do to face these kinds of infections?
Better surveillance is key detecting outbreaks early. We need rapid, sensitive diagnostic tools, especially for diseases like Lyme or prion diseases that can have long silent periods or vague early symptoms. Early diagnosis drastically improves outcomes and helps limit spread.
And treatments.
We have effective post-exposure vaccines for rabies, which is huge. We have antimicrobials for many bacterial, parasitic, fungal infections. But for prion diseases, for example, there are currently no effective treatments. Zero.
So we need new approaches.
Definitely. Research needs to focus on novel therapies. Maybe not just targeting the pathogen directly, but targeting the host pathways that are being hijacked. Could we restore neurotransmitter balance,
Yeah.
block the effects of specific toxins, modulate the neuroinflammation? Those are promising avenues.
And environmental controls were possible. That sounds tough for things like prions.
Yeah, it varies hugely. Improving building ventilation helps against airborne pathogens, but cleaning up CWD prions tightly bound to soil across vast landscapes, that's an entirely different, incredibly difficult challenge.
So we've covered a huge amount of ground here. Looking back at this big dive, what are some of the big unanswered questions that stick with you?
One is definitely about the speed and ease of evolution. How quickly can pathogens actually evolve these complex manipulation strategies? What are the specific genetic changes required? Can we get better at predicting which pathogens are sort of predisposed to developing behavioral control?
And what about the cumulative impact of the infections many of us already carry? The latent ones like T. gondii or all those herpes viruses? What's their real, subtle, long-term impact on human behavior, cognition, maybe even population level mental health trends? Are they influencing us in ways we just don't fully appreciate yet?
That's a huge question. And then there's the ethical tightrope. How do we foster the crucial research needed to understand and counter these manipulations, while simultaneously managing the very real risks that come with understanding the mechanisms of biological behavior control? And maybe, are there common master switches in the brain? Vulnerable points that lots of different manipulating pathogens seem to target, which could potentially become broad therapeutic targets down the line.
It's truly an incredible, complex, and yeah, sometimes unsettling world we've explored today. It really shows how pathogens are so much more than just simple germs causing sickness. They've evolved these astonishingly sophisticated strategies to become, in effect, biological puppeteers.
And while that idea of a zombie apocalypse is thankfully fiction, the underlying biological reality, the fact that external agents can compromise a living host's autonomy, can shape its behavior to suit their own agenda, that principle is very real and deeply fascinating.
So, maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is to just consider this intricate dance of evolution. These power dynamics playing out between hosts and pathogens, happening constantly all around us, maybe even within us, often invisibly, shaping not just our physical health, but potentially our behavior, our choices in ways we're only just beginning to grasp. What does this hidden world of biological influence really mean for our own sense of control, our individuality, perhaps even our identity?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.